How does a memorial service turn into the moment you realize the truth was hidden in plain sight? I stood beside my brother's resting place while his widow performed her sorrow for the room. Minutes later, a priest pulled me aside and whispered what my brother had confessed the night before, and from that moment on, I stopped mourning and started listening. Before we continue, we ask you to hit the hype button, subscribe, and like the video to help the channel grow. Tell us which city you are from in the comments. We would like to get to know our audience better. The first lie I noticed was how perfectly she cried. I stood 3 feet from my brother's casket, watching Elias's wife dab at her eyes with a tissue that never seemed to get wet. The church was packed wall to wall with people who barely knew him, drawn by the spectacle she had orchestrated with the precision of a theater director. Flowers everywhere, lilies, roses, arrangements so large they blocked the stained glass windows. A slideshow cycled endlessly through photos I had never seen before, most of them staged, all of them recent, like his earlier life had been erased, edited out of existence. She wore black that fit too perfectly for mourning. The dress was tailored, expensive, the kind you don't just pull from a closet on the morning of a service held in someone's memory. Her voice carried through the sanctuary when she spoke to the attendees, every word measured, every pause timed for maximum effect. I heard her tell the same story 3 times to different groups, word for word, like it had been practiced in front of a mirror. How devoted Elias was. How sudden it all was. How she would carry on his legacy with strength and grace. I kept my mouth shut and my hands buried in my pockets, feeling like an intruder at my own brother's farewell. People offered me brief condolences in passing, quick handshakes and murmured sympathy, but their attention always drifted back to her, as if pulled by gravity. She was the center, the sun everyone revolved around. I was just the older brother who worked with his hands, who smelled faintly of motor oil and sawdust, who didn't know how to perform for a crowd or say the right things at the right time. The service dragged on, stretching into what felt like hours. A pastor who had met Elias exactly twice spoke about a man I barely recognized, a polished, generic version that could have been anyone. The widow nodded along from the front pew, adding soft affirmations at precisely the right moments, dabbing at eyes that never truly overflowed, accepting tissues from concerned neighbors. I watched the clock on the back wall and counted the minutes until I could leave without causing a scene, without drawing attention to myself. Elias would have hated all of this, every single second. He was quiet by nature, thoughtful, uncomfortable in the spotlight. He preferred small rooms and honest conversations, long silences that meant something, real moments without an audience. This spectacle, this carefully staged performance of sorrow, was everything he avoided when he was still here. But he wasn't around to object anymore, and she knew it. She knew exactly what she was doing. When the service finally ended, we moved toward the cemetery in a long, slow procession. The line of cars stretched down the road, headlights cutting through the afternoon haze. I drove alone in my work truck, which looked out of place among the sedans and luxury vehicles. The widow rode in the lead car, surrounded by people speaking in hushed, reverent tones, treating her like royalty. The burial itself was thankfully brief. She stood by the gravesite with one hand resting on the polished container, her face arranged into a carefully crafted expression of sorrow that looked convincing if you didn't know what to watch for. I noticed how she glanced around now and then, making sure everyone was looking, making sure the moment was being captured by the photographer she had hired. Yes, she had hired a photographer for a burial service. I stood off to the side near the back of the gathered crowd. A few people shook my hand as they passed. Most ignored me completely. I did not mind. I was too busy thinking about the last time I had spoken to Elias, 3 months ago on a Tuesday evening, when he called me out of nowhere and asked me a strange question that I had not understood at the time. "If something happened to me," he had said, his voice tired and thin, "would you keep some papers safe, just in case something goes wrong?" I had agreed without thinking much of it, without pressing for details. He sounded exhausted, worn down by something I could not identify. I figured it was work stress or marriage troubles. Everybody has rough patches. Everybody goes through hard times. I told myself it would pass. Now, standing at his graveside, I wondered what "just in case" really meant. What had he been preparing for? The crowd began to disperse slowly, breaking into smaller groups. The widow accepted hugs and whispered condolences, playing her part flawlessly, never missing a beat. I turned to leave, ready to disappear into the afternoon and let her have her stage, let her perform for whoever was still watching. Then I felt a hand on my shoulder, gentle but firm. I turned around. Father Greaves stood behind me, his expression careful and unreadable, his gray eyes studying my face. "Celius," he said quietly, barely above a whisper. "Could I speak with you for a moment? In private. It's important." Father Greaves led me back toward the church, away from the crowd still lingering at the graveside, their voices carrying on the wind. We entered through a side door that groaned on old hinges into a small room off the main sanctuary. It smelled like old books and furniture polish, dust and history. A single window let in slanted afternoon light that cut across the floor in sharp angles. He closed the door carefully and gestured toward a wooden chair against the wall. I stayed standing, my back straight, waiting. "I apologize for the timing," he said, folding his hands in front of him the way priests do when they are about to say something difficult. "But there is something you need to know, something I've been carrying since the night before your brother passed." The room suddenly felt smaller, the walls closer. "Your brother came to see me," Father Greaves continued slowly, choosing each word with care. "Late in the evening. He asked to make a confession. It was urgent, he said. He needed to speak before it was too late." My throat tightened. I did not trust my voice, so I just nodded for him to continue. "I cannot share the specific details of what was said," the priest explained, his voice heavy with something like regret. "The sanctity of confession prevents that. But I can tell you this much. Elias was afraid, not of passing from this world. He seemed to have accepted that, but he was terrified of what would happen after he was gone. He mentioned you by name, multiple times. He said you were the only one he could trust with the truth." I felt something cold settle in my chest. "What truth?" Father Greaves moved to the window, looking out at the cemetery in the distance. He spoke about pressure, constant, relentless pressure, about feeling trapped in his own life, about decisions that were made for him, not by him, about watching himself disappear piece by piece while everyone around him pretended not to notice. The priest turned back to face me. "He asked me to tell you, if the opportunity arose, that the truth was already in your hands. He said you would understand when the time came. He said you would know what to do." I stared at him, my mind racing. "What does that mean?" "I don't know," Father Greaves admitted, "but he was very clear about it, very deliberate. He wanted you to know that he had prepared for this outcome, that he had not been careless or caught off guard. He had a plan." The folder. The manila envelope Elias had given me 3 months ago, stuffed thick with papers, my name written on the front in his neat handwriting. I had put it in my workshop, on a shelf behind the red toolbox, and honestly forgotten about it until this very moment. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked, my voice rough. "Because he asked me to," Father Greaves said simply. "Because he deserves to be heard, even now, especially now, and because I saw how that service went today. I saw who controlled the narrative. Your brother would not have wanted that." I nodded slowly, processing everything. My mind was racing through memories, conversations, small moments I had dismissed at the time but now seemed significant. "Thank you, Father," I said finally. He opened the door for me. I walked out into the hallway, past the main sanctuary where a few stragglers still lingered, looking at the flowers, and out into the parking lot where the sun was starting its descent toward the horizon. My truck was parked in the far corner, away from the other vehicles. I climbed inside and sat behind the wheel, but I did not start the engine. I just sat there, hands gripping the steering wheel, staring at the dashboard. The truth was already in my hands. I thought about the widow's performance today, the way she controlled every detail, every narrative, every story told about Elias, the way she spoke for him as if his voice had always been hers to use, as if he had never had thoughts or opinions of his own. I thought about the last time I actually saw my brother in person, not just talked on the phone. It was 4 months ago, maybe 5. He had shown up at my workshop unannounced, which was unusual for him. He looked thin, exhausted, like he had not slept properly in weeks. Dark circles under his eyes. His clothes hung loose on his frame. When I asked if he was okay, he just smiled and changed the subject. Talked about work. Asked about my current projects. Avoided every personal question I threw at him. I should have pushed harder. I should have insisted. But I had respected his privacy, given him space, assumed he would come to me when he was ready. Now he would never be ready. I sat in my truck, hands on the steering wheel, watching the sun paint the sky orange and red. People were leaving the church, heading to the reception hall where the widow had arranged yet another performance, another stage for her grief. I was not going. Not yet. I turned the key and drove home through streets I had known my entire life, past houses and buildings that held decades of memories, most of them involving Elias in some way. The folder was waiting for me. The truth was waiting, and I had a feeling that once I opened it, everything was going to change. The reception hall was unavoidable, no matter how much I wanted to skip it. I had promised Father Greaves I would make an appearance, and I kept my promises. That was how I was raised. By the time I arrived, fashionably late by anyone's standards, the event was already in full swing. Tables covered in white cloth stretched across the room, trays of food that nobody seemed to be touching, soft piano music playing through hidden speakers in the ceiling. The widow moved through the room like a politician working a campaign event, shaking hands, accepting sympathy with practiced grace, telling her carefully crafted story again and again to anyone who would listen. I stood near the back wall, next to a table with coffee urns and cups, drinking something that had gone cold an hour ago, just watching the show. She was good at this. I had to give her that much. Every gesture, every word, every facial expression was perfectly calibrated to inspire sympathy and admiration. She spoke about how much Elias loved his work, how devoted he was to family, how unexpected his passing had been, how she was still in shock. Unexpected. I turned that word over in my mind like a stone, examining it from every angle. Elias had been sick for months. Not visibly, not in any way that would draw public attention, but I had noticed. The weight loss that made his clothes fit wrong. The way he moved slower, like every step took conscious effort. The exhaustion that showed in his eyes even when he smiled. When I asked him about it, he brushed it off every time, said he was tired, said he was working too much, said he would see a doctor when things settled down at work. Now I wondered who had convinced him to wait, who had told him it was nothing, who had assured him that he was fine, that he just needed rest, that doctors were expensive and unnecessary. A woman approached me, someone I vaguely recognized from family gatherings years ago. She offered condolences in a soft voice, said something generic about Elias being in a better place now, then drifted away before I could respond. I nodded at her, retreating back, and said nothing. Across the room, the widow was talking to a small group of older people, her hand resting on the shoulder of a man I did not recognize. She laughed softly at something he said, a delicate sound that carried just far enough to be heard, but not so far as to seem inappropriate. Perfect control, perfect performance. I watched her mention the house, Elias's house, our family home that Dad had left to him. She called it our home without hesitation, talked about the difficult decisions she had been forced to make, alone, to handle everything, the estate, the arrangements, the finances. All of it managed by her, she explained, because there was simply no one else to help. She did not mention me, did not mention that Elias had a brother who might have wanted to be involved in those decisions, did not acknowledge that maybe, just maybe, family should have been consulted before assets were moved and arrangements were made. I finished my cold coffee and set the cup down on the table harder than I intended. A few people nearby glanced at me. I ignored them. Then something clicked in my memory, a conversation I had forgotten until this moment. 6 months ago, maybe longer, Elias had called me late at night, past midnight. I remember because I had been asleep and the phone startled me awake. He sounded strange when I answered, distracted, like he was thinking about something else entirely while talking to me. He asked me if I remembered the summer when we were kids, when we built that treehouse in the backyard. We had hidden a box of comic books up there, tucked away in a corner where Mom wouldn't find them and throw them out. She thought comics were a waste of time, a waste of money. I said yes, of course I remembered. Those comics were worth a fortune now, if we still had them. Elias was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that seemed random at the time, but now felt like a message I had missed. Sometimes you have to hide things to keep them safe, he said. Sometimes that's the only way to make sure they survive. At the time, I thought he was being nostalgic, caught up in childhood memories. I told him to get some sleep and we would talk more in the morning. He agreed and hung up. We never talked about it again. Now I realized he was not being nostalgic. He was telling me something important. He was explaining what he had done. I left the reception hall without saying goodbye to anyone, slipping out through a side exit while the widow was occupied with another group of admirers. Nobody noticed me leave. Nobody cared. The night air was cool and clean after the stuffiness of the hall. I walked to my truck, climbed inside, and sat there for a moment, thinking about hiding places and the things we protect. Then I drove home to find what my brother had hidden. My workshop was exactly as I had left it that morning. Tools hung on pegboards in precise order, sorted by size and function. The workbench was clean, every project labeled and stacked according to priority. I liked systems. I liked things that made sense, that followed logical patterns, that could be understood through careful observation. The folder was where I remembered leaving it, behind the red toolbox on the second shelf, pushed back against the wall where it would not be disturbed. A thick manila envelope with my name written in Elias's careful handwriting across the front. I pulled it down and carried it to the workbench. My hands were steady as I opened it, but my heart was hammering against my ribs. Inside were documents, Copies, not originals, which meant Elias had been smart about this. Bank statements going back 3 years, property records with dates and signatures, a handwritten letter on notebook paper dated 3 months ago to the day, and a smaller sealed envelope with instructions written on the outside in red ink, open only if absolutely necessary. I read the letter first, my eyes tracking across the familiar handwriting. Elias apologized for the burden he was placing on me. He explained that he had tried to handle things quietly, to resolve the situation without involving anyone else, but that some situations could not be resolved alone. He said he trusted me to know when the time was right, to understand when action was needed and when patience was required. Then he laid out dates, specific conversations, decisions that had been made without his input or consent. He wrote about feeling erased from his own life, about watching his identity be rewritten in real time by someone who claimed to love him, about being told what he thought, what he wanted, what he believed, until he started to doubt his own memories. He did not use her name anywhere in the letter. He did not have to. Every word made it clear who he was talking about. The bank statements told a story in numbers and transactions, joint accounts that had been systematically drained over 2 years, large transfers to accounts in her name only, always just under the reporting threshold, withdrawals that Elias had never authorized, never even knew about until the money was gone. The property records showed the house, our father's house, the house Elias had inherited, had been quietly transferred to her sole ownership 2 years ago. The signature on the transfer documents looked like Elias's handwriting, but something about it was wrong. The pressure was different, the spacing was off. I sat back and stared at the papers spread across my workbench, feeling something cold and hard settle in my stomach. Elias had not been careless. He had been documenting everything, building a case, preparing evidence. He had known exactly what was happening to him, and he had been meticulous about recording it. The question was, why had he not used this evidence while he was still alive? Why had he waited? Then I remembered his exhaustion, his weight loss, the way he had looked in those final months. Maybe he had not been waiting, maybe he had simply run out of time. The next morning, I drove to a small cafe on the edge of town, a place that served breakfast all day and where nobody paid attention to anybody else's business. A family friend was waiting in a back booth, someone who had worked with Elias years ago before he changed jobs. Tom Brennan, late 50s, gray hair, honest eyes. He ordered coffee and eggs. I ordered nothing, just sat across from him and waited. I heard about the service, Tom said carefully. I wanted to go, but honestly, I was not sure I would be welcome there. Things got complicated between Elias and his wife toward the end. Complicated how? I asked. Tom looked at me for a long moment, deciding something. Then he set his fork down and leaned forward. About a year ago, Elias called me out of the blue, he said quietly. We had not talked much since he changed companies, but he needed to talk to someone, and I guess he figured I was safe. He told me he felt like he was disappearing, that every decision in his life was being made for him, that he did not recognize his own life anymore, like he was watching someone else live it. Did he say why he did not leave? I asked. He said he tried, Tom replied. Multiple times. But every time he brought it up, every time he even hinted at it, things got worse. Not just arguments. Worse. He started finding things missing from his office. Important documents. Passwords changed on accounts. He felt like he was being erased deliberately, systematically. I nodded slowly, thinking about the bank statements. He was afraid, Tom continued. Not just uncomfortable or unhappy. Actually afraid. He said he needed to be careful, that he needed to document everything before making any moves. He asked me to remember our conversation in case something happened to him. Why did you not tell anyone? I asked. Tom looked down at his plate. Because he made me promise not to. He said it would only make things worse. He said he had a plan, that he was handling it. I trusted him. He paused. I should not have. I thanked Tom and left money on the table for his breakfast. Then I drove across town to a law office in a building that looked like it had been standing since the 50s. The attorney was middle-aged, professional, and refreshingly blunt. Her name was Catherine Hayes. She had been recommended by someone I trusted. I laid the documents on her desk and explained everything. She listened without interrupting, making occasional notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, she sat back in her chair and studied me. If everything you have told me is accurate, she said carefully, and if these documents hold up under scrutiny, then your brother was very deliberate about what he was doing. These records establish a clear pattern, the timing of the transfers, the lack of consent, the systematic isolation. It paints a very specific picture. What happens now? I asked. That depends entirely on what you want to happen, Catherine said. If you want to challenge the estate distribution, you can. If you want to bring these matters to light publicly, you can do that too. But you need to understand something. Once you start this process, once you make these allegations public, there is no walking it back. You need to be absolutely certain this is what you want to do. I thought about Elias, about the man he was before the performance began, before his life was taken over and rewritten, about the brother I had known growing up, quiet and thoughtful and decent. I want the truth on record, I said. I want people to know what really happened. That's what he would have wanted. Catherine nodded. Then we will make sure it gets there. But we need to do this properly, methodically, no mistakes. That's fine, I said. I am good at methodical. She almost smiled. I believe you are. I left her office with copies of everything, the originals safely locked in her filing cabinet. As I walked to my truck, I felt something shift inside me. This was not about anger or revenge. This was about making sure my brother's voice was finally heard, even if he could no longer speak for himself. A week after the funeral, an announcement went out through the church bulletin and social media. A follow-up gathering at the church community hall, organized by the widow to honor Elias's memory and thank everyone who had supported her during this difficult time. She framed it as a celebration of life, an opportunity for proper closure, a chance to move forward together. The invitation was public, open to anyone who wanted to attend. I received mine through email like everyone else. The subject line read, "Honoring Elias, a community gathering." I spent the days leading up to it organizing everything with the same precision I applied to my work. Not just the documents, but timelines, witness statements, confirmations from banks and notaries. Every piece of evidence arranged in chronological order, every claim backed by something tangible and verifiable. Catherine helped me prepare a statement, not a speech, nothing emotional or performative, just facts laid out in sequence, dates, actions, outcomes, things that could not be argued with, could not be dismissed as opinion or interpretation. Father Greaves had agreed to allow the use of the hall, but only after I promised him that everything would remain civil. No confrontations, no accusations shouted across the room, everything presented calmly and clearly. I gave him my word, and I meant it. Elias had done most of the heavy work already. He had kept meticulous records over the years. He had written everything down, saved every document, noted every suspicious transaction. All I had to do was make sure the right people saw it all, make sure the truth could not be buried or explained away. The lawyer helped me understand what would stand up legally and what was just circumstantial. She showed me how to present evidence so it could not be dismissed, how to build a case that was airtight and unquestionable. We verified everything twice, bank statements confirmed through official channels, property records pulled directly from county offices, witness statements notarized and dated, nothing left to chance. I also spent time tracking down people who had known Elias well, people who had noticed changes in him over the past few years. Tom Brennan was not the only one. There were others. Co-workers, old friends, distant relatives who had been quietly concerned but never said anything publicly. Each conversation added another piece to the puzzle. Stories of Elias being increasingly isolated, of events he used to attend that he suddenly stopped going to, of hobbies he loved that he gave up without explanation, of friends who called and were told he was too busy to talk, too tired to visit, too overwhelmed to maintain relationships. A pattern emerged, slowly at first, then all at once. It was not just about money or property. It was about systematic isolation, about cutting him off from anyone who might have helped, about controlling every aspect of his life until there was nothing left that was truly his. 3 nights before the gathering, I sat in my kitchen at midnight and read through everything one final time. The letter Elias had written to me. The bank statements showing thousands disappearing from joint accounts. The property records showing the house transferred without his real consent. The sealed envelope I had finally opened, which contained a notarized statement Elias had prepared 5 months before his passing. In that statement, written in his careful, precise handwriting, he described feeling coerced into decisions he did not agree with. He wrote about being isolated from family and friends through carefully engineered circumstances. He detailed how assets were moved without his knowledge, how he was told it was for his own good, for tax purposes, for estate planning, how he lost control of his own life piece by piece while being told he was imagining things, being paranoid, being difficult. The statement ended with a single line that made my throat tight. I trust my brother to do what I could not do myself. I folded the papers carefully and put them back in the folder. Then I sat in the dark kitchen, thinking about trust and responsibility and the weight of promises made to people who were no longer here to release you from them. The widow had been posting on social media throughout the week, building anticipation for the gathering, photos of flowers and candles, quotes about healing and community, posts about carrying on Elias's legacy with grace and strength. She had no idea what was coming. Catherine had advised me to tell no one about my plans, not even Father Greaves, beyond the basic commitment to keep things civil. The element of surprise was important. It meant she could not prepare a counter-narrative, could not get ahead of the story, could not shape public perception before the truth came out. The night before the gathering, I barely slept. Not because I was nervous, but because my mind would not stop running through every possible scenario, every potential complication, every way this could go wrong. But by morning, I was calm, clear-headed, ready. I got up early, showered, dressed in clean clothes. Not a suit. I did not own a suit and would not wear one if I did, but decent pants and a button-down shirt. Respectable, serious. I ate breakfast slowly, checking and rechecking the folder one more time. Everything was there. Everything was in order. Then I drove to the church through morning traffic, arrived an hour early, and waited in my truck while others began to show up. The widow arrived in a different car than she had driven to the funeral, something newer and more expensive. She got out wearing a dress that was elegant, but not somber, having apparently decided that enough time had passed to lighten the performance slightly. She walked into the hall surrounded by people offering support, accepting compliments on her strength, her grace, her resilience. I watched from my truck and felt nothing but a cold certainty about what needed to happen next. When enough people had gathered that my entrance would not be noticed or questioned, I grabbed the folder from the passenger seat and walked inside. The hall was already filling up. I took a seat near the back, in a corner where I could see everything but remain relatively unnoticed. The widow saw me from across the room. For just a moment, her smile faltered. Then it snapped back into place, brighter than before, and she made her way toward me through the crowd. "Celius," she said warmly, reaching out to touch my arm. "I am so glad you came. It means so much that you are here." "Would not miss it," I said evenly. She studied my face, trying to read something in my expression. I gave her nothing to work with. Just looked back at her calmly. "We will be starting soon," she said. "I have prepared some remarks, personal stories. I hope you will stay through the whole thing." "I plan to," I said. She hesitated, like she wanted to say something else, then thought better of it. She nodded once and walked away, glancing back at me twice before returning to her position at the front of the room. I settled into my chair and waited. The truth was already in my hands. It had been for 3 months. Now it was time to let everyone else see it too. The gathering began exactly on schedule, which did not surprise me. The widow was nothing if not organized. She stood at the front of the community hall with a microphone in hand, positioned in front of a table covered with photos of Aloyas, the same carefully curated images from the funeral slideshow, nothing from before he married her. She thanked everyone for coming with a voice that carried just the right mix of sadness and strength. She spoke about Elias's kindness, his generosity, his love for family and community. She talked about the future, about carrying on his legacy through charitable work and community service. She mentioned establishing a foundation in his name, something to help others the way Elias had always helped others. People applauded softly. Some wiped their eyes. The performance was working exactly as she had planned it. She continued for nearly 15 minutes, telling stories that sounded meaningful but were actually hollow, generic anecdotes that could have applied to almost anyone. She talked about how Elias loved his work, but never mentioned what that work actually was. She spoke about his devotion to family, but did not name any specific family members. Everything was vague, surface level, carefully constructed to sound personal without actually revealing anything real about who he was. I watched people's faces. Most of them were buying it, nodding along, accepting this sanitized version of my brother as truth. A few looked uncomfortable, like they sensed something was off, but could not quite identify what. When she finished her prepared remarks, she opened the floor for others to share memories. This was standard for these kinds of gatherings, a chance for community members to feel included, to participate in the collective remembering. A few people stood and spoke. An older woman who lived down the street from them shared a story about Elias helping her fix a broken fence. A man from his previous job talked about a project they worked on together years ago. A couple who knew them socially mentioned dinner parties and neighborhood gatherings. All of it was vague, surface interactions. Nothing that touched who Elias actually was beneath the public image. Then I stood up from my seat in the back corner. The room went quiet immediately. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. People turned to look at me. The widow's smile froze on her face, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the edge of the table. "I have something to share," I said clearly. My voice carried across the hall without the microphone. Years of working in loud environments had taught me how to project. I walked down the center aisle toward the front, the folder held firmly in my hands. Father Greaves was standing near the side door. He gave me a small nod, subtle but meaningful. He knew what was coming. I had told him that morning. I did not take the microphone from the widow. I did not need it. I stopped about 10 feet from the front table and turned to face the room. Elias was my brother, I began. And I think most of you sitting here did not really know him. That is not your fault. He was a quiet man by nature. He did not like attention or crowds. He did not perform for audiences. He preferred genuine conversations with people he trusted. I paused, looking around the room. People were listening, confused about where this was going. Before he passed, I continued, Elias came to Father Greaves and made a confession. He talked about feeling trapped in his own life, about decisions being made for him without his input or consent, about being afraid of what would happen after he was gone, afraid that the truth would be buried along with him. The silence in the room was absolute now. You could have heard a pin drop. He also left documents, I said, holding up the folder. Records, bank statements, property transfers, timeline notes, all of it notarized, all of it legal, all of it verified through official channels. He gave these to me 3 months before he passed and asked me to keep them safe. He said I would know when the time was right to share them. The widow stood frozen at the front, her face losing color. This is inappropriate, she said, her voice shaking slightly. This is not the time or place for... This is exactly the time and place, I interrupted calmly. Because Elias wanted the truth on record. He wanted people to know what really happened during the last years of his life. And he trusted me to make sure that happened, even if he could not do it himself. I opened the folder and pulled out the notarized statement Elias had written 5 months before his passing. I began to read it aloud, slowly and clearly, making sure every word was heard. I, Elias Oren, write this statement of my own free will, while of sound mind, to document concerns about decisions being made regarding my assets and personal affairs. I read every sentence, every detail, the descriptions of joint bank accounts being drained without his knowledge, property transferred from his name through documents he never signed, isolation from family members through carefully manufactured conflicts and excuses, medical decisions delayed and discouraged despite clear symptoms requiring attention. The room listened in stunned silence. A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others leaned forward, listening more intently. When I finished reading the statement, I set it down on the table next to the widow's photo display. Elias was not careless, I said. He was not foolish or naive. He knew exactly what was happening to him, and he documented everything carefully, methodically, because he knew he might not be able to speak for himself eventually. He made sure there would be evidence, a record that could not be denied or explained away. I pulled out the bank statements next, holding them up so people could see. These show joint accounts in both names. Watch the pattern over 2 years. Large transfers to single-name accounts. Always just under the reporting threshold. Never discussed, never authorized by Elias. I laid the bank statements across the table, fanning them out so the dates and amounts were visible to anyone who cared to look closely. The numbers told a story that required no interpretation. Money flowing steadily out of joint accounts into accounts bearing only her name. Thousands at first, then tens of thousands. A systematic transfer of assets disguised as normal financial management. These transfers began shortly after their 5th anniversary, I continued, pointing to the earliest statement. Notice the pattern. Every transfer happens on a Monday or Tuesday, never on weekends, never when Elias would have been home to check the accounts, always during his work hours when he was at the office, when he had no reason to be monitoring their finances. The widow tried to speak, but her voice came out weak. Those were legitimate expenses. House repairs, investments, planning for our future. Investments in accounts he had no access to, I said. Property he did not know had been purchased. Planning for a future that only included one person. I pulled out the property records next, official documents with county seals and notary stamps. I held up the deed transfer for the house, the home our father had left to Elias, the place where we had grown up. This is the property transfer for Elias's house, I said. The house our father built with his own hands, the house he left to Elias in his will, clearly stated, legally binding. 2 years ago, this house was transferred from Elias's name to a single owner. The signature on the transfer document looks like his handwriting, but watch closely. I pulled out another document, one I had obtained from the county recorder's office. This is Elias's actual signature from his driver's license renewal, dated 1 month before the supposed property transfer. Compare them. The pressure is different, the angle of the letters is wrong, the spacing does not match. I set both documents side by side on the table where people in the front rows could see them clearly. Several people stood up and moved closer to examine the signatures. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. A forensic document examiner reviewed these, I continued. Her official report is included in this folder. She concluded with high confidence that the signature on the property transfer was forged. Elias never signed this document. He never authorized the transfer of his home. The widow's face was pale now, her carefully constructed composure crumbling. You have no right to make these accusations. You were not there. You did not see how hard I worked to take care of him. I saw how isolated he became, I said, my voice still calm and measured. I saw how he stopped attending family gatherings, how he stopped calling friends, how he gave up hobbies he had loved his entire life, not because he wanted to, but because he was being systematically cut off from everyone who might have noticed what was happening. I turned to address the room again. How many of you tried to reach Elias in the past 2 years? Called his phone and were told he was too busy to talk? Invited him somewhere and heard he was too tired, too stressed, too overwhelmed? How many times did you accept those excuses without questioning them? Several people in the audience looked down at their hands. A few nodded slowly, remembering. Tom Brennan stood up from his seat near the middle. I called him regularly, he said, his voice rough. For months, maybe longer. Every time I called, she answered. Told me he was resting or working or could not come to the phone. After a while, I stopped calling. I thought he did not want to talk to me anymore. An older woman near the front raised her hand slightly. I invited them to Thanksgiving dinner 2 years ago. Family tradition. Elias always came. She said he was not feeling well, that they would stay home. I thought he was sick. Now I wonder if he even knew about the invitation. More people began to speak up. A pattern emerged of invitations declined, calls unreturned, connections severed. All of it explained through her, filtered through her voice, shaped by her narrative. Isolation is a tool, I said. Cut someone off from their support system, from people who might ask difficult questions, and you can control their entire reality. Make them doubt their own perceptions. Make them think they are the problem. I pulled out another document, a letter from Elias's former employer. This is from the company where Elias worked for 12 years. He was a valued employee, up for promotion, respected by colleagues. Then suddenly he resigned. No notice period, no farewell, just submitted his resignation through email and never came back. I held up the resignation letter. This email was sent from his personal account at 3 a.m. Elias was not a night person. He went to bed early and woke up early every single day of his adult life. But supposedly, he sent this career-ending email at 3 a.m., giving up a job he loved and a promotion he had worked toward for years. He was unhappy there, the widow said desperately. He wanted a change. He told me. He told you, but he never told his boss, I interrupted. Never told his colleagues. Never mentioned it to me or anyone else in his family. Just this one email at 3 a.m. and a career ended. I turned to the crowd. I contacted his former supervisor. She said Elias never seemed unhappy. He talked about the promotion, about future projects, about retirement plans. Then one morning, this email arrived, and he was gone. When she tried to call him to discuss it, to make sure everything was okay, the calls were never returned. Father Greaves stepped forward from the side of the room. His presence commanded immediate attention. I must confirm something, he said quietly. Elias did come to me for confession the night before he passed. While I cannot share the specifics of what was said, I can tell you this. He was afraid. He spoke about being trapped, about losing control of his own life. He asked me to ensure that his brother received certain information after his passing. What Celias is sharing with you today aligns with what Elias told me in confidence. The priest's words carried weight. People who might have dismissed my allegations as family drama or grief-fueled accusations could not dismiss the testimony of a priest. Father Greaves had no stake in this beyond honoring a man's final request. The room erupted into whispers and murmurs. People turning to each other, processing what they were hearing, reevaluating everything they thought they knew. The widow stood at the front, no longer the center of sympathetic attention, but the focus of suspicious scrutiny. Her carefully constructed image was collapsing in real time, brick by brick. "These are lies," she said, her voice rising. "He is making this up because he is jealous, because Elias chose me over his family, because Elias documented everything," I said, cutting through her desperation. "He kept records for years. He notarized statements. He filed copies with a lawyer. He made sure that even if he could not speak for himself, the evidence would speak for him." I pulled out the final document, the one that had been in the sealed envelope marked "open only if necessary." It was a medical record, officially stamped and signed by a doctor Elias had seen 6 months before his passing. "This is from a Dr. Elias visited on his own during a work trip to another city," I said. "He went without telling anyone, paid in cash, used an urgent care clinic where nobody knew him. The doctor noted significant weight loss, chronic fatigue, symptoms that warranted immediate further investigation. The doctor strongly recommended Elias see a specialist as soon as possible and gave him referral information. I held up the document. Elias never followed up on those referrals, never saw a specialist. When I asked him about his health in those final months, he told me he was fine, just tired. But according to this doctor's notes, Elias said he had tried to schedule appointments before but was told by his wife that he was overreacting, that he just needed to rest, that doctors were too expensive. The widow's face flushed red. That is not true. I never said that. I encouraged him to see doctors. Then why did he have to go to an urgent care clinic in another city? I asked. Why did he have to pay cash so the visit would not show up on insurance statements? Why did he feel the need to hide a medical visit from his own wife? The room was completely silent now. Even the whispers had stopped. Everyone was watching, waiting to see what would happen next. Catherine Hayes stood up from where she had been sitting quietly near the back. She had come as my legal counsel, present to ensure everything was handled properly. For the record, she said in a clear, professional voice, all of the documents presented today have been filed with the appropriate authorities. The district attorney's office has been provided copies, the county has been notified about the potentially forged property transfer, and a formal challenge to the estate distribution has been filed with probate court. She looked directly at the widow. You will be receiving official notification of these filings within the next few days. I strongly suggest you retain legal counsel. The widow looked like she had been struck. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The mask had shattered completely. There was no performance left, no carefully crafted grief, no strategic sympathy, just exposure and the beginning of consequences. I gathered the documents from the table and returned them to the folder. I looked around the room one last time. Elias was a good man, I said. A quiet, decent person who trusted the wrong person and paid the price for it. He deserved better than what he got. He deserved to be heard. And now, finally, he has been. I walked toward the door. People stepped aside to let me pass, watching me with expressions that ranged from shock to understanding to something like respect. The widow called after me, her voice breaking. Wait, this is not fair. You do not understand? I stopped and turned back to her. You are right, I said. I do not understand how someone could do what you did to a person who trusted you, but I do not need to understand it. I just need to make sure everyone else knows the truth. Then I walked out of the community hall into the afternoon sunlight, leaving behind the wreckage of her carefully constructed lies. The parking lot was mostly empty when I stepped outside, just a few cars belonging to people who had arrived early. The afternoon sun was bright and warm, a stark contrast to the heavy atmosphere I had just left behind in the hall. I stood there for a moment, feeling the tension drain from my shoulders, the folder still clutched in my hands. I heard the door open behind me. Father Greaves walked out, his expression thoughtful and calm. That took courage, he said quietly. It took evidence, I replied. Courage would have been speaking up when he was still alive, when it might have actually helped him. The priest shook his head. You cannot blame yourself for not seeing what was deliberately hidden from you. Elias made his choices. He protected you from knowing until he was ready for you to act. That was his decision, not yours. I nodded, but did not fully accept it. The guilt was still there, sitting heavy in my chest. The knowledge that I had seen the signs, but dismissed them. That I had noticed my brother fading, but attributed it to stress or work or marriage problems that were none of my business. What happens now? Father Greaves asked. Now the system takes over, I said. Lawyers, investigators, courts, everything gets examined officially. Everything gets decided by people who are not emotionally involved. And you? I go back to work. I go back to my life. I have done what Elias asked me to do. The rest is not my responsibility. The priest studied me for a moment. Will that be enough for you? I thought about that. It has to be. I cannot bring him back. I cannot change what happened. All I can do is make sure the truth is on record. Make sure people know who he really was and what was done to him. If that is not enough, then nothing would be. Father Greaves nodded slowly. He chose well when he chose you. He knew you would follow through, no matter how difficult it was. More people began to emerge from the hall, leaving in small groups, talking in hushed voices. They glanced at me as they passed, some with sympathy, some with curiosity, some with something that might have been respect. None of them approached or tried to speak to me. I was fine with that. Tom Brennan came out a few minutes later, walking directly toward me. His face was grave, but his eyes were clear. I should have pushed harder when he called me that last time, Tom said. I should have known something was seriously wrong. We all should have, I replied. but she was good at controlling the narrative, at making everything seem normal from the outside. She had years of practice. "What you did in there," Tom said, gesturing back toward the hall, "that took guts. A lot of people would have just let it go, let her keep the story she had built, especially after he was already gone." "He asked me not to let it go," I said simply. "So I did not." Tom nodded. "If you need anything, if there are questions during the investigation, or if you need someone to verify what Elias was like before all this, you call me, anytime." "I will, thank you." He shook my hand firmly and walked to his car. I watched him drive away, then turned back to see Catherine Hayes approaching. She had her briefcase in one hand and her phone in the other. "That went as well as we could have hoped," she said. "Clean, factual, no emotional outbursts that could be used against you later. The witnesses heard everything clearly. Father Greaves's testimony added credibility, and having everything documented and filed beforehand means she cannot claim this was just a family dispute or a personal attack." "How long before things move forward officially?" I asked. "The DA's office will need time to review everything," Catherine explained. "Probably a few weeks at minimum. The probate challenge will take longer, maybe months. But the foundation is solid. Elias did good work documenting everything. Most people in his situation do not think clearly enough to keep records like this." "He was always methodical," I said. "It was one of the things we had in common." "It will serve him well, even now," Catherine said. She paused, then added, "You should prepare yourself for pushback. She will hire lawyers. They will try to discredit the evidence, claim the signatures were legitimate, suggest Elias was mentally unwell. It's standard procedure in cases like this." "Let them try," I said. "The evidence speaks for itself, and there are too many witnesses now. Too many people heard what happened in there. The story cannot be contained anymore." Catherine nodded approvingly. "That is exactly the right attitude. Stay calm, stay factual, let the system work. Your part is essentially done. Now we let the professionals handle it." She left, and I was alone in the parking lot again. The sun was starting to sink lower in the sky, painting everything in shades of orange and gold. I walked to my truck, put the folder carefully on the passenger seat, and sat behind the wheel. My phone buzzed. Text messages coming in from people I had not heard from in months. Family members and friends who had apparently already heard about what happened at the gathering. Word spread fast in a community this size. I did not read the messages. Not yet. I would deal with them later. Instead, I started the engine and drove home through familiar streets, past the house where Elias and I grew up, past the park where we played as kids, past the school we attended together. Memories everywhere, most of them good ones from before everything got complicated. When I got home, I sat in my workshop for a while, not working on anything, just sitting in the space that made sense to me. Tools in order, projects organized, everything logical and understandable. I thought about Elias's final request, the trust he had placed in me to do what he could not do himself, the burden of being the one who survived, the one who had to speak for someone who could no longer speak. It was not fair. None of it was fair, but fair was not the same as right. And what I had done today was right, even if it was difficult, even if it opened old wounds and created new complications. I had kept my promise to my brother. I had made sure his voice was heard, his truth was told, his suffering was acknowledged. That would have to be enough. The next few weeks passed in a strange combination of routine and chaos. I went to work every day, fixed HVAC systems, talked to clients about maintenance schedules. The familiar work kept me grounded while everything else swirled around me. Catherine kept me updated through regular calls. The DA's office had assigned someone to review Elias's case. The probate court had scheduled hearings. The county recorder's office was examining the property transfer with forensic specialists. The widow had hired expensive lawyers from 3 cities over. They sent letters threatening countersuits, demanding I cease making defamatory statements. Catherine responded with copies of all the evidence, making it clear that truth was an absolute defense against defamation. The community response was mixed. Some believed the evidence immediately, others remained skeptical. A few stayed loyal to the widow, convinced she was being unfairly attacked. Tom Brennan called regularly, sharing things he heard through mutual connections. Other people who had known Elias were coming forward with observations they had dismissed at the time. A neighbor remembered seeing Elias outside late at night, looking exhausted and lost. A colleague mentioned finding him in his car during lunch breaks, just sitting there, staring at nothing. The forensic document examiner's report came back official. The signature on the property transfer was highly likely forged. The pressure points were wrong, the flow inconsistent. Several letters showed hesitation that would not appear in someone signing their own name naturally. The bank responded with detailed records showing transfers initiated through online banking, always from the home IP address. Elias's work computer and phone showed no history of accessing these accounts. Everything pointed in the same direction. Not opinion, but facts. Digital footprints, paper trails, evidence that could not be argued away. Catherine called one afternoon while I was finishing a job downtown. "The DA has decided to move forward," she said. "Financial exploitation, forgery, fraud, and now medical neglect contributing to wrongful outcome. They found evidence that Elias's condition was treatable if addressed early enough." I sat in my truck, processing that. What does that mean? "This is a serious criminal case now," Catherine explained. "The evidence is overwhelming. Her lawyers are advising her to take a plea agreement. They know they cannot win at trial." "What kind of plea?" "Full restitution. All assets returned. The house goes back to you, and prison time, 3 to 5 years. 3 to 5 years. It was not enough to balance what she had taken from Elias, but it was something. It was consequences. "The plea hearing is in 3 weeks, Catherine said. "You have the right to be there." "I will be there," I said. My phone rang that evening, an unknown number. "Is this Celius Oren?" A woman's voice, professional but warm. "Yes?" "My name is Patricia Kim. I was a therapist who saw your brother Elias about 8 months ago. I just heard about the gathering. He came for 3 sessions. He was struggling with feeling erased from his own life. He talked about his marriage, about feeling controlled. I recommended he continue therapy, but he stopped coming after the 3rd session." "Why?" "His wife found out and was very upset. She told him seeking therapy meant he thought something was wrong with their marriage. He felt guilty and stopped. I am willing to provide a statement to authorities about his concerns." "Thank you," I said, my voice rough. "Thank you for trying to help him." After she hung up, I sat in the darkness thinking about Elias reaching out for help and being pulled back, about him fighting in his own quiet way for as long as he could. And when he knew he was losing, he had made sure someone else could continue the fight. 3 weeks later, I sat in the courtroom wearing clean, respectable clothes. The widow entered with her lawyers flanking her. She looked smaller, diminished. The performance was gone. The mask was shattered. The judge reviewed the plea agreement methodically. 3 years in state prison, followed by 2 years of supervised release, full restitution of all assets, permanent restraining order, a criminal record that would follow her for life. "Do you understand these terms completely?" the judge asked. "Yes, Your Honor," the widow said quietly. "And do you accept this plea agreement?" She hesitated, looked at her lawyers. They nodded. She turned back. "Yes, Your Honor, I accept." The judge looked at her for a long moment. "This court finds the plea agreement acceptable. The defendant is remanded to custody immediately." The gavel came down with a sharp crack. 2 bailiffs moved forward. She was handcuffed and led toward the door. She did not look back. The door closed with a solid metallic sound. I sat there feeling something release in my chest. A weight lifting. A promise kept. Catherine appeared beside me. "It is done. The house transfers back next week. Everything Elias wanted is happening exactly as he intended." I nodded. "He was lucky to have you," she said. "I was lucky to have him," I replied. I walked out into bright afternoon sunlight. Tom Brennan was waiting on the steps. "You did right by him," Tom said. "I kept my promise," I said. I drove home through familiar streets. The burden was gone. The truth had been told and heard and acted upon. That evening, I stood in my workshop with the folder that had changed everything. I looked through the documents Elias had carefully prepared, remembering how they had shifted everything at the community gathering. Elias had been thorough and methodical. He had made sure that even from beyond reach, his voice could still be heard. I closed the folder and placed it on a high shelf. Complete, finished, the promise was kept. The truth was told, justice was done. I had done what my brother could not do himself.